All right, hello everybody. We are continuing the Encyclopedia Logic. And by the way, I am Antonio Wolf, in case you don't know. We're continuing from the last we left off a couple of months ago, section 31. Uh, we'll see if this refreshes me as to like what we were dealing with last time. Uh, but it's Hegel. We'll find our place. So, the common conceptions of God, the soul, the world may be supposed to afford thought a firm and fast footing. They do not really do so. Besides having a particular and subjective character clinging to them and thus leaving room for great variety of interpretation, they themselves, first of all, require a firm and fast definition by thought. This may be seen in any of these propositions where the predicate, or in philosophy the category, is needed to indicate what the subject or the conception we start with is. In such a sentence as God is eternal, we begin with the conception of God, not knowing as yet what he is. To tell us that is the business of the predicate. In the principles of logic, accordingly, where the terms formulating the subject matter are those of thought only, it is not merely superfluous that these categories predicate the propositions in which God, or still vaguer, the Absolute, is the subject, but would also have the disadvantage of suggesting another canon than the nature of thought. Besides, the propositional form, and for proposition it would be more correct to substitute judgment, is not suited to express the concrete, and the true is always concrete, or the speculative. Every judgment is by its form one-sided and to that extent false. So it says, the predicate is supposed to tell us what a thing is, but see, according to well, he hasn't really got into detail. Going back over a little bit, in the principles of logic, accordingly, where the terms formed in subject matter are those of thought only, it is not merely superfluous to make these categories predicates to propositions in which God, or still vaguer, the Absolute, is a subject, but it would also have the disadvantage of suggesting another canon than the nature of thought. So, insofar as we want to know what thought really is, we want to know that this medium of intelligibility can actually tell us anything at all, appealing to something that is presupposed to not be thought, in which you say, well, God is eternal. For example, well, here I have my thought, and I'm making claims about God, but I haven't validated whether thought itself is, valid for making any such claims or capable to know. And all these things, God, being, eternality, they're all concepts. So in trying to appeal to something that is not thought, I've just assumed that thought can tell me anything. So this metaphysic was not free or objective thinking. Instead of letting the object freely and spontaneously expound its own characteristics, metaphysics presupposed it ready-made. If anyone wishes to know what free thought means, he must go to Greek philosophy. For scholasticism, like these metaphysical systems, accepted its facts and accepted them as a dogma from the authority of the Church. We moderns, too, by our whole upbringing, have been initiated into ideas which it is extremely difficult to overstep, on account of their far-reaching significance. But the ancient philosophers were in a different position. They were men who lived wholly in the perceptions of the senses, and who, after the rejection of mythology and its fancies, presupposed nothing but the heaven above and the earth around. In these material, non-metaphysical surroundings, thought is free and enjoys its own privacy, cleared of everything material and thoroughly at home. This feeling that we all are on our own is characteristic of free thought, of that voyage into the open where nothing is below us or above us, and we stand in solitude with ourselves alone.
What a beautiful paragraph.
Uh, it is, and he's playing off Kant's metaphor of thought as well in the Critique of Pure Reason, where he says, thought is like we're like sailors, like looking for land and all these other things.
Here, thought feels itself at home with nature, being, right? Like, I've always thought about the way Hegel talks about Greek philosophy as a very special moment in which thought and being were immediately united, right? A time before the complete separation between subject and object, in which thought still was confident that its own determinations were determinations of being, right? A moment of innocence. And I think he really has some nostalgic feeling about that, or at least to try a new self conscious unity with nature and being.
I would say so. Continuing, section 32. In the third place, this system of metaphysics turned into dogmatism when our thoughts never ranges beyond narrow and rigid terms, we are forced to assume that of two opposite assertions, such as were the above propositions, the one must be true and the other false. Just a comment on the stuff like he said earlier. He mentioned something about proposition. He says propositions. It would be more correct to call them judgments.
Oh, interesting.
And that judgments are always one-sided, and this is something that is very rarely commented on because he doesn't work that way generally, so he doesn't see a reason to comment on it. But he does comment on it in a few places, in which, there's something he calls the speculative proposition, and the speculative proposition has to say opposite things at the same time, which appears immediately as nonsense. It's like being is nothing is a speculative proposition, but a speculative proposition is one-sided because you have to have like a double contradiction. You can't have just one. Being is nothing, but being is also not nothing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the point is the judgment form is incapable of expressing proper truth. There is not a single sentence, not one, in the form of a judgment, because you can have sentences sometimes include many judgments within them.
Yeah.
But a proper atomic, let's say, sentence is just a singular judgment, and no singular judgment can ever express the proper truth. It's impossible. So what analytic philosophy does, for example, which is trying to find the perfect phrase, the perfect singular judgment to express something is just not going to happen.
Yeah. That's a very good point.
And you find that out really quickly when you start trying to accomplish that, even in a set of a few judgments in one sentence. It's just not possible. You can't say everything you need to say. So the whole bare syllogistic form is not really conducive to philosophical thought. It's a very peculiar thing. You can make things more intelligible in a lucid, common, flowing conversation than you can with trying to shrink things down into these very strict syllogisms. So
The thing is,
go ahead.
I'm sorry. I forgot. Sorry. Please continue.
Right. Dogmatism may be most simply described as the contrary of skepticism. The ancient skeptics gave the name of dogmatism to every philosophy, whatever holding a system of definite doctrine. In this large sense, skepticism may apply the name even to philosophy, which is properly speculative. But in a narrow sense, dogmatism consists in a tenacity which draws a hard and fast line between certain terms and others opposite to them. We may see this clearly in the strict either-or, for instance. The world is either finite or infinite, but one of these two must be. It must be. The contrary of this rigidity is the characteristic of all speculative truth. No such inadequate formulae are allowed, nor can they possibly exhaust it. These formulae speculative truth holds in union as a totality, whereas dogmatism invests them in their isolation with a title to fixity and truth. It often happens in philosophy that the half-truth takes its place beside the whole truth and assumes on its own account the position of something permanent. But the fact is that the half-truth, instead of being a fixed or self-subsistent principle, is a mere element absolved and included in the whole. The metaphysics of understanding is dogmatic because it maintains half-truths in their isolation, whereas the idealism of speculative philosophy carries out the principle of totality and shows that it can reach beyond the inadequate formularies of abstract thought. Thus, idealism would say, the soul is neither finite only nor infinite only. It is really the one just as much as the other, and in that way neither the one nor the other. Ooh, gotta save that. So I have an article in which that was relevant. In Western logic, we have like it's either A is either true or it is false, and with that we have the arising of the principle of non-contradiction. It can't be both, and the principle of the excluded middle. It can't be neither. Yeah, so it seems that we have those. It's either true, it's either false. Can't be both. Can't be not both. 4. In Indian philosophy, strangely, for reasons which aren't really good reasons, in my opinion, and I will just classify that as an opinion because I haven't really looked deeply into it as to why they really thought this beyond the formality that they could. In Indian philosophy, they have something called the Scatus Scoti. And they say things can be true, they can be false, they can be both true and false, and they can be neither true nor false. 4 possible judgments.
Logic, right?
It's not even multi-valued. I don't know what the hell they were thinking, because I think that they justified it on the count that, like, given empirical claims in which you can misapply a judgment, it could be the case.
Yeah,
you can like if you use the wrong category on something, and then given a judgment that unifies that, you can show it could be the case that it could be true, it could be false, it could be neither true nor false because it was the wrong category in the first place, or it could be both because it's some further category that actually instantiates both in a different way.
Like they also add like words as maybe, in these logics. Like you can do a formal system, like it's just like you can do a certain specific geometry by assuming different sets of axioms. You can do that with logic too. It's like fancy playing with forms, It's like it's the reduction of logic to calculus, to formal systems based on certain axioms, right? On certain rules, which can be varied. They are, different kinds of formal systems according to what it is being presupposed.
It's part of, in consequence of how the negation worked. So the way they didn't have like neutrality in the way we have. So if you wanted to say, neither pleasant nor painful or something, then it would be, the word for that is literally the entire neither pleasant nor painful. Right.
For the contradiction thing, you could say either a thing is round or is square. Well, suppose you have a thing that's a cylinder. On one side it's square, on the other side it's round. So it's both round and square.
Right.
And then you could have a case in which the excluded middle would be that you make a dichotomy for something that has neither dichotomy. Like, well, it instantiates neither side. So you can say it's either round or square, but you have something that's triangular, and you say, well, it's neither round and it's neither square. But you see how like that judgment only works on an empirical misattribution of a judgment, and it has really nothing to do with the nature of the judgment itself. But those are the examples that I've seen, and I've never, like I said, I've never looked into this deeply as to like whether there were like further reasons, which there probably were. I mean, this was and it still is something that people study too a bit. So there must be some deeper justification as to why they thought this.
Well, since we're still in the East, let's not leave just yet, because it reminds me of the Buddhist idea of two truths. That there is local truth and global truth for nomenclature, conventional truth and ultimate truth, concrete truth and abstract truth. And they're not distinct; they're unified, but they're both like the same. And of course, there's different interpretations. There's Mahayana, which like takes it as epistemological, and I think another version that takes it as ontological. Although I'm not sure how that works.
Yeah.
So-
So Mahayana, they turned it into an ontological difference. Those Dharma Guptakas in their Abhidharma or Abhidharma.
Yeah, so
Because it was largely around like a doctrinal dispute of this thing called the mind stream, right? So it's very similar to like Platonic substance, right? So the question was, right, if there's no self, then what is it which transmigrates across three births? And so the mind stream became this ontic concept. Like it took like a substantive quality, and so this was, it had a lot of import for like describing what nirvana was, where like one of the best examples of the Chaskoti is where they're asking whether like the Buddha exists after Parinibbana, like after the death of the body. And so they say it does. Does the Tathagata exist after death? Does the Tathagata not exist after death? Does the Tathagata both exist and not exist? Does the Tathagata neither exist nor
yeah, that's what I was getting at in reference to the soul quote, that it's neither finite, infinite. It's not either. It's not neither.
Right. So Nagarjuna is the most famous for synthesizing or really kind of negating, like desubstantializing existence. I'm actually reading this essay called Buddhist Illogic by Avisayan, where he's critiquing Nagarjuna's logic, where I don't have I have a lesser known work from Nagarjuna. It's called the 70 Stanzas. it's all about existence and non-existence, and um, and kind of about, the big thing that people are most acquainted with is like denying inherent existence.
Yeah, okay.
Like
Not to cut you like
non-essentiality.
short, but we're getting off on like too much of a tangent. I just want to
Sorry,
continue.
yeah, my bad.
Yeah, it's no problem. Just wanted to like show that like one, a lot of people aren't even aware of Indian logic, but two, this is something in which like Indian logic happened to be correct, unlike Western logic. It's a curious thing, because Hegel does have that structure. For example, just with becoming, is becoming being? Yes. Is becoming nothing? Yes. Is it both? Yes. Is it neither? Yes. And it's neither because it contains both, but it's not reducible to both. So it's clearly not either one. So it's a four-valued logic. All values are instantiated. So continuing. In other words, such formulators in their isolation are inadmissible and only come into account as formative elements in a larger notion. Such idealism we see even in the ordinary phases of consciousness. Thus we say of sensible things that they are changeable. That is, they are, but it is equally true that they are not. We show more obstinacy in dealing with the categories of the understanding. These are terms which we believe to be somewhat firmer, or even absolutely firm and fast. We look upon them as separated from each other by an infinite chasm, so that opposite categories can never get at each other. The battle of reason is a struggle to break up the rigidity to which the understanding has reduced everything. Section 33. The first part of this metaphysics in its systematic form is ontology, or the doctrine of the abstract characteristics of being. The multitude of these characteristics and the limits set to their applicability are not founded upon any principle. They have in consequence to be enumerated as experience and circumstances direct, and the import ascribed to them is found only upon common sensualized conceptions, upon assertions that particular words are used in a particular sense, and even perhaps upon etymology. If experience pronounces a list to be complete, and if the usage of language by its agreement shows the analysis to be correct, the metaphysician is satisfied, and the intrinsic and independent truth and necessity of such characteristics is never made a matter of investigation at all. To ask if being, existence, finitude, simplicity, complexity, etc. are notions intrinsically and independently true must surprise those who believe that a question about truth can only concern propositions, as to whether a notion is or is not with truth to be attributed, as the phrase is, to a subject. And that falsehood lies in the contradiction existing between the subject in our ideas and the notion to be predicated of it. Now, as the notion is concrete, it and every character of it in general is essentially a self-contained unity of distinct characteristics. If truth then were nothing more than the absence of contradiction, it would be first of all necessary in the case of every notion to examine whether it, taken individually, did not contain this sort of intrinsic contradiction.
Yeah, that's great. I damn near highlighted like the entire section 33 because it's the true criticism of this older metaphysics is to grasp the nature of whatever content is named in the subject and predicate to determine if it's even legitimate formally,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and here I would interpret because people would say like, well, what could be contradictory about being? Right? But Hegel is somebody for whom what is in play in an argument is not just what you say, but what you do in saying it. What is implicitly happening on the domain of meaning in what you say. So you say, oh, being is all there is. Well, the fact that you stated it shows that that's false. There's clearly more than being. You are some kind of differentiated agent within that, making some kind of statement. There's various differences ongoing. Like you can't help it. You performatively contradict yourself, and there must be an accounting of that. If you want to make an account of truth, well, then you're talking about an account of what is the case. Well, what is the case is some differentiated being is making a claim that there is no differentiated being. Well, how are you going to account for that? Section 34. The second branch of the metaphysical system was rational psychology, or pneumatology. It dealt with the metaphysical nature of the soul, that is, of the mind regarded as a thing. It expected to find immortality in a sphere dominated by the laws of composition, time, qualitative change, and quantitative increase or decrease. The name rational, given to the species of psychology, served to contrast it with empirical modes of observing the phenomena of the soul. Rational psychology viewed the soul in its metaphysical nature and through the categories supplied by abstract thought. The rationalist endeavored to ascertain the inner nature of the soul as it is in itself and as it is for thought. In philosophy at present, we hear little of the soul. The favorite term is now mind, or spirit. The two are distinct, soul being, as it were, the middle term between body and spirit, or the bond between the two. The mind, as soul, is immersed in corporeity, and the soul is the animating principle of the body. Those who know just a little bit about Hegel would say he's contradicted himself here. The soul is being, as it were, the middle term between the body and spirit, or the bond between the two. Well, how can it be a bond if it isn't the higher unity of the two? It'd be the sublation of the spirit and the body. Whereas what you will hear normally is spirit is sublation of the soul and the body. But it all works out in Hegelian logic. The pre-Kantian metaphysics, we say, viewed the soul as a thing. Thing is a very ambiguous word. By a thing we mean, firstly, an immediate existence, something we represent in sensuous form, and in this meaning the term has been applied to the soul. Hence the question regarding the seat of the soul. Of course, is the soul have a seat? It is in space and sensuously envisaged. So too, if the soul be viewed as a thing, we can ask whether the soul is simple or composite. The question is important as bearing on the immortality of the soul, which is supposed to depend on the absence of composition. But the fact is that in abstract simplicity we have a category which as little corresponds to the nature of the soul as that of compositeness. One word on the relation of rational to empirical psychology. The former, because it sets itself to apply thought to cognize mind and even to demonstrate the results of such thinking, is the higher, whereas empirical psychology starts from perception, and only recounts and describes what perception supplies. But if we propose to think the mind, we must not be quite so shy of its special phenomena. Mind is essentially active in the same sense as the schoolmen. Scholastics said that God is absolute actuosity, or actuality. But if the mind is active, it must, as it were, utter itself. It is wrong, therefore, to take the mind for a processless ends of being, as did the old metaphysics, which divided the processless inward life of the mind from its outward life. The mind of all things must be looked at in its concrete actuality, in its energy, and in such a way that its manifestations are seen to be determined by its inward force. Section 35. The third branch of metaphysics was cosmology. The topics it embraced were the world, its contingency, necessity, eternity, limitation in time and space, the laws, only formal, of its changes, the freedom of man and the origin of evil. To these topics it applied what were believed to be thoroughgoing contrasts, such as contingency and necessity, eternal and internal necessity, external and internal necessity, efficient and final cause, or causality in general and design, essence or substance and phenomenon, form and matter, freedom and necessity, happiness and pain, good and evil. The object of cosmology comprised not merely nature, but mind too, in its external complicating. The object of cosmology comprised not merely nature, but mind too, in its external complicating, in its phenomenon. Seems like some little comma there is missing, but I don't know where.
Yeah, that reads weird.
In mine, it just says complication, where it says complicating.
Let's see. The object of cosmology comprised not merely nature, but mind too. in its external, complicating in its phenomena. Yeah, it's that second part that's just weird. In fact, existence in general, or the sum of finite things. So, compressed not merely nature in its external, complication in its phenomena. Like, of its phenomena would make sense. Anyways, I think like the gist is like the nature as a whole and like the aspects of nature were still distinguished, so that like some account had to be given as to why nature was complex. So in fact, existence in general, or the sum of finite things. This object, however, it viewed not as a concrete whole, but only under certain abstract points of view. Thus, the questions of cosmology attempted to solve were such as these. Is accident or necessity dominant in the world? Is the world eternal or created? It was therefore a chief concern of this study to lay down what were called general cosmological laws, for instance, that nature does not act by fits and starts. And by fits and starts, saltus, they meant a qualitative difference or qualitative alteration showing itself without any antecedent to determining mean, whereas on the contrary, a gradual change of quantity is obviously not without intermediation. In regard to mind as it makes itself felt in the world, the questions which cosmology chiefly discussed turn upon the freedom of man and the origin of evil. Nobody can deny that these are questions of the highest importance. But to give them a satisfactory answer, it is above all things necessary not to claim finality for the abstract formulae of understanding, or to suppose that each of the two terms in an antithesis has an independent subsistence, or can be treated in its isolation as a complete and self-centered truth. This, however, is the general position taken by the metaphysicians before Kant, and appears in their cosmological discussions, which for that reason were incapable of compassing their purpose to understand the phenomena of the world. Observe how they proceed with the distinction between freedom and necessity in their application of these categories to nature and mind. Nature they regard as subject in its workings to necessity. Mind they hold to be free. No doubt there is a real foundation for this distinction in the very core of the mind itself, but freedom and a necessity, when thus abstractly opposed, are terms applicable only in the finite world to which, as such, they belong. A freedom involving no necessity, and mere necessity without freedom, are abstract and in this way untrue formulae of thought. Freedom is no blank indeterminateness, essentially concrete and unvaryingly self-determinate. It is so far at the same time necessary. Necessity, again, in the ordinary acceptation of the term in popular philosophy, means determination from without only, as in finite mechanics, where a body moves only when it is struck by another body and moves in the direction communicated to it by the impact. This, however, is a merely external necessity, not the real inward necessity, which is identical with freedom. The case is similar with the contrast of good and evil, the favorite contrast of the introspective modern world. If we regard evil as possessing a fixity of its own, apart and distinct from good, we are to a certain extent right. There is an opposition between them. Nor do those who maintain the apparent and relative character of the opposition mean that evil and good in the absolute are one, or in accordance with the modern phrase, that a thing first becomes evil from our way of looking at it. The error arises when we take evil as a permanent positive, instead of what it really is, a negative which, though it would fain assert itself, has no real persistence, and is in fact only the absolute sham existence of negativity in itself. That was a whole discussion on good and evil. Was it last week or something? Somebody arguing exactly this, that they didn't like the view that comes out of that evil is itself non-being, and therefore, like, it doesn't really exist. And they thought that, Neoplatonics and Scholastics and others that had these views were saying, oh, well, evil is just an illusion. It's all good, but, you just can't see it. And Hegel's saying here, no, there is evil. It's just that evil is kind of a blip, a glitch that erases itself out because, it's like a self-destroying engine. You get a bad engine, it will blow itself up or, ruin itself because it's not put together correctly. So it takes itself out of the picture anyways. So it only exists parasitically upon the good. It has some determinate existence, but no existence in and of itself. The fourth branch of metaphysics is natural or rational theology. The notion of God, or God as a possible being, the proofs of his existence and his properties form the study of this branch. A. When understanding thus discusses the deity, its main purpose is to find what predicates correspond or not to the fact we have in our imagination as God. And in doing it assumes the contrast between positive and negative to be absolute, and hence in the long run nothing is left for the notion, as understanding takes it, but the empty abstraction of indeterminate being, of mere reality or positivity, the lifeless product of modern deism. The method of demonstration employed in finite knowledge must always lead to an inversion of the true order, for it requires the statement of some objective ground for God's being, which thus acquires the appearance of being derived from something else. This mode of proof, guided as it is by the canon of mere analytic identity, is embarrassed by the difficulty of passing from the finite to the infinite. Either the finitude of the existing world, which is left as much a fact as it was before, clings to the notion of deity, and God has to be defined as the immediate substance of that world, which is pantheism, or he remains an object set over against the subject, and in this way finite, which is dualism. The attributes of God, which ought to be various and precise, had, properly speaking, sunk and disappeared in the abstract notion of pure reality, of indeterminate being. Yet in our material thought, the finite world continues, meanwhile, to have a real being, with God as a sort of antithesis, and thus arises the further picture of different relations of God to the world. These, formulated as properties, must, on the one hand, as relations to finite circumstances, themselves possess a finite character, giving us such properties as just, gracious, mighty, wise, etc. On the other hand, they must be infinite. Now, on this level of thought, the only means, and a hazy one, of reconciling these opposing requirements was quantitative exaltation of the properties, forming them into indeterminateness, into the sensuous eminentior. Don't know what that word is.
I mean, it's the same Latin in my version.
It's Latin, but what does it mean? Comparative degree of eminence. To stand out, project, protrude. Oh, so emanation.
Eminence?
To stand out, project, protrude. So it's more like a eminenting, like emanating. Okay. But it was an expedient which really destroyed the property and left a mere name. The object of the old metaphysical... Yeah, sorry, go.
Sorry, continue. I was going to say it nullifies the attribute.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's all.
The object of the old metaphysical theology was to see how far unassisted reason could go in the knowledge of God. Certainly a reason-derived knowledge of God is the highest problem of philosophy. The earliest teachings of religion are figurative conceptions of God. These conceptions, as the Creed arranges them, are imparted to us in youth. They are the doctrines of our religion, and insofar as the individual rests his faith on these doctrines and feels them to be the truth, he has all he needs as a Christian. Such is faith. And the science of this faith is theology. But until theology is something more than a bare enumeration and compilation of these doctrines ab extra, it has no right to the title of science. Even the method so much in vogue at present, the purely historical mode of treatment, which, for example, reports what has been said by this or the other father of the church, does not invest theology with a scientific character. To get that, we must go on to comprehend the facts by thought, which is the business of philosophy. Genuine theology is thus at the same time a real philosophy of religion, as it was, we may add, in the Middle Ages. That's rare. He usually hates the Middle Ages, but said something nice for once. And now let us examine this rational theology more narrowly. It was a science which approached God not by reason but by understanding, and in its mode of thought employed the terms without any sense of their mutual limitations and connections. The notion of God formed the subject of discussion, and yet the criterion of our knowledge was derived from such an extraneous source as the materialized conception of God. Now, thought must be free in its movements. It is no doubt to be remembered that the result of independent thought harmonizes with the import of the Christian religion. For the Christian religion is a revelation of reason. But such a harmony surpassed the efforts of rational theology. It proposed to define the figurate conception of God in terms of thought, but it resulted in a notion of God which was what we may call the abstract of positivity or reality, to the exclusion of all negation. God was accordingly defined to be the most real of all beings. Anyone can see, however, that this most real of beings, in which negation forms no part, is the very opposite of what it ought to be and of what understanding supposes it to be. Instead of being rich and full above all measure, it is so narrowly conceived that it is, on the contrary, extremely poor and altogether empty. It is with reason that the heart craves a concrete body of truth, but without definite feature, that is, without negation contained in the notion, there can only be an abstraction. When the notion of God is apprehended only as that of the abstract or most real being, God is, as it were, relegated to another world beyond, and to speak of a knowledge of him would be meaningless. Where there is no definite quality, knowledge is impossible. Mere light is mere darkness. The second problem of rational theology was to prove the existence of God. Now, in this matter, the main point to be noted is that demonstration, as the understanding employs it, means the dependence of one truth on another. In such proofs, we have a presupposition, something firm and fast, from which something else follows. We exhibit a dependence of some truth from an assumed starting point. Hence, if this mode of demonstration is applied to the existence of God, it can only mean that the being of God is to depend on other terms, which will then constitute the ground of his being. It is at once evident that this will lead to some mistake, for God must be simply and solely the ground of everything, and insofar not dependent upon anything else. And a perception of this danger has in modern times led some to say that God's existence is not capable of proof, but must be immediately or intuitively apprehended. Reason, however, and even sound common sense give demonstration a meaning quite different from that of the understanding. The demonstration of reason no doubt starts from something which is not God, but as it advances, it does not leave the starting point a mere unexplained fact, which is what it was. On the contrary, it exhibits that point as derivative and called into being, and then God is seen to be primary, fully immediate, and self-subsisting, with the means of derivation wrapped up and absorbed in himself. To those who say, "Consider nature, and nature will lead you to God. You will find an absolute final cause," do not mean that God is something derivative. They mean that it is we who proceed to God himself from another, and in this way God, through the consequence, is also the absolute ground of the initial step. The relation of the two things is reversed, and what came as a consequence being shown to be an antecedent, the original antecedent is reduced to a consequence. This is always the way, moreover, whenever reason demonstrates. If, in the light of the present discussion, we cast one glance more on the metaphysical method as a whole, we find its main characteristic was to make abstract identity its principle and to try to apprehend the objects of reason by the abstract and finite categories of the understanding. But this infinite of the understanding, this pure essence, is still finite. It has excluded all the variety of particular things, which thus limit and deny it. Instead of winning a concrete, this metaphysics stuck so fast on an abstract identity. Its good point was the perception that thought alone constitutes the essence of all that is. It derived its materials from earlier philosophers, particularly the schoolmen. In speculative philosophy, the understanding undoubtedly forms a stage, but not a stage at which we should keep forever standing. Plato is no metaphysician of this imperfect type, still less Aristotle, although the contrary is generally believed. Okay, well, that's the end of the first attitude to objectivity. What was the first attitude?
I think it was just the older metaphysics. Free content.
Yeah, just dogmatism, given content.
Yeah. And the next one is empiricism. Yep.
Yeah, so first you have ontology, then you have epistemology. And then Kantianism is the peak of epistemology. But I think he treats it as a critical philosophy. Oh no, yeah, it's still part of epistemology, because it's still section 4. Okay. Well, that's good. We can leave that there. See you around next time.